Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stephen Lieberman. I am one of the owners of the Artemis Defense Institute. The armed woman that you see walking around back there in the white shirt, that's Sandy Lieberman, for those of you who don't know. She is the visionary behind the Artemis Defense Institute. This is her business. It's what she came up with. And this particular type of event is exactly what we had always dreamed that we would be able to do. Provide these types of town hall opportunities whenever there's an issue of what we would consider to be national interest. And clearly, this particular issue is at the top line of national interest right now. I want to give an introduction to all of our panel members and kind of give you a little background on myself and explain how tonight's evening is going to work. This is your event. What we are going to be doing is having each one of these presenters giving a sort of a brief synopsis of what their sort of initial thoughts are on what is in fact causing children to become violent and ultimately kill one another. Once each one of these guys have had an opportunity to kind of give an opening statement, for lack of a better term, we'll be going back and then individually sort of articulating some of the potential solutions. Each one of us has an already established idea of some of the things that could be done that could potentially save lives. We'll go through and we'll listen to their ideas. After that, we'll open up to sort of an internal discussion where we'll be able to talk to one another and sort of explore different ideas. At this time, you guys will also be invited to participate. All it's going to take is a raise of your hand, and you can ask any one of the panel member questions. And that, in and of itself, is going to start inspiring dialogue. One of the problems that we have, especially with this particular issue, whenever a fundamental right is being potentially threatened, we tend to have a belief system that the problem that exists outside of our lane. Our area, whether it be gun rights or whether it be psychology or whether it be pharmacology or anything like that, our lane is pristine. There's nothing that potentially that we're doing or not doing that's causing any sort of problems. The problem is the other guy. The problem is the other lane. And candidly, that might not even be the case. The problem might actually be a combination of multiple lanes. In any event, one of the things that we saw after Parkland was an immediate coarsening of discussion. People would not talk to one another. When they did talk, they talked in platitudes, and they talked in memes. Well, national conversation is not going to take place by belittling the other person or by holding sacred ideals that haven't been tested themselves. So that's what this is for. It's to kind of flush these things out. Are we going to come to any solutions tonight? I doubt it. Are we going to have any epiphanies tonight? Hopefully. It's not inconceivable that the answer that exists to this very problem will actually be addressed this evening. But without having this type of discussion with multiple experts from different fields, we're not going to be able to have that epiphany. So that's what this is for. It's a breeding ground for ideas. All right? Let me give you a brief background on myself, and then we'll kind of go down the line. My name's Stephen Lieberman. As I already introduced you, my wife and partner Sandy Lieberman, we own the Artemis Defense Institute. I'm an attorney. I'm a use of force policy attorney. I'm a military officer. I serve in the California State Military Reserve as a JAG officer. My law partner, Cosmo Terramino. Where are you, Cosmo? I don't even see you. Is he eating? He's probably eating right now. Okay. Cosmo Terramino, actually, he serves in the military with me. The guy outranks me, actually. That's a problem in and of itself. We are civil rights attorneys. That's a very pleasant way of saying that we're criminal defense attorneys. Our firm represents CCW holders, law enforcement officers, military personnel, and cases that have been directly referred to us by the National Rifle Association. My background, obviously, I've been in the shooting sports for most of my life. And Sandy was kind enough to open up this business venue to allow us to develop our passion together for gun safety and training. Right here to my left is Dr. John Chang. Dr. Chang is a board-certified family physician and sports medicine physician. He's a member here at the Artemis Defense Institute, and he's a medical director at the South Coast Medical Group, Family Medicine and Urgent Care. Next to him is Laura Rydell, also a member here at the Artemis Defense Institute. Laura is a licensed marriage family therapist and a licensed educational psychologist with over 30 years of experience. Her counseling office is in Mission Viejo, where she specializes in providing support for children and teens with learning and behavior problems and their families. She has published a newsletter, Parents as Teachers, taught parenting classes and community education classes, and provided therapy for teenagers and hospital treatment programs. She is retired from the school system, where she worked 35 years as a school psychologist, special education administrator, and director of student support services. Next to Laura is Jason McCurry. Those of you who have met Angelica, our HR director, our special events coordinator, and the woman who normally sits at the front desk during the day, Jason is fortunate enough to be married to her. Jason has been a follower of Jesus Christ for the past 23 years. He served as a soldier for Jesus for 2 years, ministering to motorcycle clubs. He has also led local weekly Bible studies at Cook's Corner and Hell's Kitchen, bringing the Word of God to the biker community. Jason lets the Lord direct his path, and most recently has led a discipleship group, a men's Bible study, and has become a loud voice for life by trying to help those so young they don't have a voice to speak for themselves. Have you ever seen a pastor that scares the hell out of you more than Jason? Next to Jason is Clay Cranford. He's a school resource officer. Clayton is one of the nation's leading law enforcement educators on social media, child safety, behavioral threat assessments, and the author of Parenting in the Digital World, which is available on Amazon. He created Cyber Safety Cop, a comprehensive internet and social media safety program. It teaches parents and students how to avoid online threats such as cyberbullying, online predators, pornography, and social media addiction. He has served as a member of the Orange County School Threat Assessment Team. He's a school resource officer and crisis negotiation team. He has investigated threats, weapon possession, violent crimes in K-12 schools throughout Orange County, California. And Clayton was awarded the 2015 National Bullying Prevention Award from School Safety Advocacy Council and the 2015 American Legion Medal of Merit for his bullying prevention work. Next to Clayton is Kendra Weber. Some of you know Kendra's father, Lindell, who can't hear a single thing that I'm saying because he's completely deaf, but he does know that I'm talking about his daughter right now. Kendra is graduating with her PhD in political science this June. She is trained in social, quantitative, and qualitative methods. In addition to this, she has been teaching political science courses for over 5 years at local community colleges and University of California at Riverside. Next to Kendra is Ryan Kroger. Ryan Kroger is an AP physics teacher. Ryan Kroger graduated from UC Irvine with a Bachelor of Science in Physics in 2001. He has been working as a high school teacher in Orange County ever since. When he is not in the classroom, Ryan works with current school and district administration on gathering and analyzing student data on topics ranging from academic performance to student discipline and student behavioral health. Ryan is also a member here at the Artemis Defense Institute. And next to Ryan, Phil Robb, our final member here at Artemis. Phil is a video game developer at Turtle Rock Studios just up the street. Phil Robb has worked in game development since 1994. In the past 24 years, Phil has made significant contributions to a diverse array of popular titles while employed at some of the most successful companies in gaming. These companies include Take-Two Interactive Software, Westwood Studios, Electronic Arts, and Valve Corporation. In 2008, Phil co-founded Turtle Rock Studios in Orange County, based independent studio to develop games for PC, console, and virtual reality platforms. As you can see, this group was assembled primarily for their backgrounds. Oftentimes, we hear talking heads in the media say, the problem is clear. It's the lack of God in the schools. Or you'll hear others say, it's the pharmacological experience. Every child today is on Ritalin, and that's what's causing kids to kill. And we all have heard the same thing. It's those damn video games. Their access to video games is causing otherwise good, well-behaved children to kill. I personally believe that none of those independently is the cause of anybody actually killing anyone. It's my contention as an attorney that the biggest single issue that we've seen with children killing other children is an abject lack of empathy. And I'll expand on that here in just a couple of moments. First and foremost, I want to articulate my position as it comes to access to firearms. Firearms, the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, as far as I'm concerned, they are all equal in value. The Second Amendment of the Constitution exists for a very specific reason. It's intended to protect against tyranny. Oftentimes, tyranny is believed to be an oppressive government trying to operate in an extrajudicial manner. That is too much of a limiting articulation of tyranny. Tyranny exists from the individual level all the way up to the nation-state level. Governments can absolutely be tyrannical. So can individuals. A bullying individual that is trying to destroy the life of another individual is a tyrant. An abusive spouse can be a tyrant. The Second Amendment is a singular protection against tyranny. Now, having said that, it is a fundamental principle. Go along with what some of you have heard in my CCW class, and I'm sure Jason will agree with me. These rights that are codified within the Constitution, these rights are granted to us not by the framers, not by the Constitution itself, not by any singular government that happens to exist at any given time in our nation. These rights were conferred to us directly by the Creator. They must be. They cannot be created by individuals. If they are, then these rights become transient. They become flippant. They can be taken away at any moment when suddenly the majority decides that they want to deprive these rights of a minority. And these rights were specifically granted to individuals to protect minorities. Minority of color, minority of classification, and sometimes minority of thought. In any event, these rights come to us from the Creator. They are transmutable. They are universal human rights. The First Amendment to the Constitution exists in Mexico. The Third Amendment to the Constitution exists in England. As an aside, that's Cosmo's favorite amendment. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution exists in Belarus. And the Second Amendment to the Constitution exists in Russia. These rights are universal. They're mankind's rights. It's just that our framers in the 1700s recognized these rights and codified them into our Constitution. Other states are not as enlightened, but those rights still exist. Now, with that understanding, my argument, quite frankly, is that there are certain principles that we must hold sacred. The right to keep and bear arms falls within this. It is a right that was granted by the Creator. So if we're going to abrogate that right, we have to do so with extreme sobriety. We're going against the wishes of the Creator. And if we do so, it must be for a social principle that transcends even Him Himself. And He must be able to provide us with something in the alternative. It stands to reason. You as individuals have an absolute right to exist. To deny you the opportunity to effectuate that right to exist, in my opinion, is effectively sacrilegious. Now, with that understanding, we have to look at what causes, especially adolescent youth, to engage in the kinds of behaviors that they've been engaged in for really the last 50 years. I believe that it is a fundamental lack of empathy with these individuals. It's one of the things we see again and again and again. It's not necessarily that they're psychotic. It's not necessarily that they're on Ritalin or anything like that. It's not even necessarily that they've been playing violent video games. It's that for whatever reason, and I quite candidly don't know the cause, they've developed a belief system where there's no empathy. They can't actually view another human being as though they view themselves. And once that empathy is lost, once that inability to connect with another individual is lost, the dehumanization process begins. Take that dehumanization process to the next level, where suddenly a person becomes nothing more than an object. Have this ideal system continue to be reinforced through video games, through pornography, through things that essentially show other human beings, whether male or female, as nothing more than an inanimate object designed for the use of this individual. It only stands to reason that the next step is a sense of self-empowerment, where they're willing to become violent based on some perceived aggrieved status, because they're not killing people, they're killing objects that have simply bothered them. I don't know how to instill empathy with somebody that's broken. What I do know is that we can take two individuals, essentially bring them up in the same socioeconomic environment with the same access to all the video games and all the pornography and all the internet and lack of God and everything else. We can take those same two individuals, one shoots up a school and the other one goes to college and becomes a physician. There has to be something beyond just the stimuli that's causing this. And hopefully tonight we'll be able to glean some of these answers. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Cheng. Dr. Cheng, if you will give some of your thoughts. You can do it from right here. We'll stand at the podium.
So some of my thoughts are coming from two hats that I wear. One is a patriotic citizen who's a father of two, a 13-year-old son who's going into high school, and my daughter who's 11 who's in middle school. That's what, how do I keep them protected? The other hat that I wear is as a clinician, as a family physician. I care for the bread and butter coughs and colds, high blood pressure, doing physical exams, but I also take care of a lot of patients that do have ADD, do have depression and anxiety. And where do I lie in all that? I'm trying to keep honest with the theme of what's driving our kids to kill and how do we stop it. When these mass shooters become more prevalent in our society, I started thinking, well, gosh, how am I going to protect my kids? And so there's some proactive things that I've done thinking that it could help. And number one is just talking to them and just giving them instructions on what to do in a mass shooter type situation at school shooting. My daughter is still comprehending that. It's a little bit more difficult, but one of the things that I've done is, this is the paranoid side of me, but now I don't think it's paranoid, is I've given him a little bulletproof shield to bring to school, and it's in his notebook. And this is what you do when you hear the shooting.
I think it's legitimate.
You know, this is what you can do. What can a 13-year-old kid do other than run? But if the teachers are kind of locking them in because they have to like hide and then run and then fight only if you can, that's somewhat reasonable maybe for an older individual, but for these young kids, what can they do? And try to explain that to my daughter, she's 11, she has trouble watching a Marvel movie because it's too violent for her. You know, where my son and I embrace it. So I have to walk that fine balance of how much do I reveal to her about the real world and to get at the same time keep her protected. So I think we'll have that conversation here in the next few months when I think that she's kind of coming of age, and have that discussion as a parent. As a role as a physician, when I was asked to be part of this panel, I was like, well, what can I really add? Because I'm relatively new to this Pro 2A lifestyle, and where am I coming in at this? And as a physician, we're kind of ingrained to, I'm supposed to ask patients my questions of, do you have a gun in the home? That's what they teach us to say, or ask. It's part of, when you go through the PEDS rotation, that's part of your training, is you're supposed to ask whether they drink or smoke, do they engage in high-risk activities, and then do you have a gun in the home?
Oh, I'm screwed.
He said a gun. Yeah. You have a gun in the home. What am I as a clinician supposed to do with that information? And if you're looking at it from a public health perspective, such as, okay, well, this person has a high-risk behavior and they may be more at risk of HIV, we can do some counseling. Oh, this person's overweight and they have high cholesterol. Oh, we can do some counseling or start some medications. Oh, this person has a gun in the home. What am I supposed to do? Well, make sure it's locked up. So there's parts of me that kind of go back and forth on, what am I supposed to counsel this person on? They're a grown adult, they should be responsible, but yet you have certain things, certain individuals that are irresponsible with owning a firearm. That's one portion, and the other portion is, gosh, I'm taking care of a lot of depressed individuals in Orange County. They are normal individuals, but then again, I may have a biased group, because people that come see me where I work, they usually have jobs, they usually have insurance, so that means that they're somewhat stable to keep a job, and they're somewhat stable to pay into an insurance plan to come in to see me. So I may be seeing a biased subset of patients, but in terms of taking care of them, these are depressed individuals who have ADD, or they may have depression, they may have anxiety, they may be getting bullied. And so I do write for those medications. In my practice, I haven't seen major issues arise, but I have had patients say, hey, when I'm on these meds, or if I'm cutting down when I'm not supposed to, I'm cutting down, I do get more anxious, I do get more irritable, I do feel more upset or angry. And those are real symptoms that they describe, but we haven't seen, I haven't seen it to where it's causing mass shootings.
If I can interrupt you for 1 second, one thing that, and I'm, just so you guys are aware, I'm probably going to be interrupting that from time to time. One of the things that concerns me is that we actually have become ultra focused on the gun, and that being focused on the gun, and this goes back to your, you know, what do you have in the home? Do you smoke? Do you drink? Do you have a weapon? Do you ask if they have steak knives in the home? Do you ask if they drive vehicles at that particular household? So we tend to do this. We tend to sit there and create a tabooed item. And by looking at that tabooed item, we miss the greater picture. And that's not blaming you by any stretch of the imagination. That has to do with the way the medical profession is established. But I think that translates into a lot of the different mentality. If we can focus on the gun, then we're actually taking away from the greater social ill that's taking place. So, Don, I'm going to hold you for a second. I'd like to actually have Ms. Rydell go ahead and introduce and go ahead and give your thoughts.
Would it help if I stood there?
Sure.
Okay. It's funny because I think I have a loud voice. All right, here we go.
From the lungs, Laura.
All right. So I actually do treat people with depression that Dr. John was talking about, but I'm not the one that prescribes medication. The difference is, if you're a psychiatrist, you're first a medical doctor, and you can prescribe medication. Only people with a medical degree can do that. I don't have that degree. I have a master's in counseling, okay? So if I think somebody needs medication, I have to refer them to their family doctor or to a psychiatrist to get that. And I've actually seen it help a lot of people that were struggling. So I agree with Dr. John about depression being a really important key for people, but I'm going to tell you why it ties into shootings. After the Columbine High School shootings, the United States Department of Education commissioned a study to determine a psychological profile of school shooters. The only two descriptions that held true for all of them were depression and a history of suicide attempts. That's the only thing all of them had in common. So now we know that those are two key indicators we're going to be looking for, right? There was another study that found that 2/3 of school shooters who survived to talk about it said they had been bullied and felt persecuted, threatened, and attacked at school. That's really important information for the educators. And for parents, you need to watch for signs of depression and suicidal thinking in your teens. Other signs of potential trouble are, and these are the students that end up in my office: poor anger control, poor impulse control, obsession with weapons and violence, being bullied or bullying others, social isolation, and mental disorders. And then hats off to Stephen Lieberman, who is not even a psychologist. Other markers for violence, and I'm just going to name you the one that he said, is lack of empathy. And empathy is defined as the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. These people don't connect like most normal people do. Some of the school shootings now display a new quality. They are premeditated and choreographed, down to the weapons used and the clothes worn. Frank Roberts, a criminologist and director for the Institute for Violence Prevention and Applied Criminology, was to design guidelines for preventing violence in schools. Now, I used to work in the schools, okay? So this is really important for us to know as educators. These researchers are understanding some of the motivations of young shooters and have identified several warning signals that can help predict school rampages. They have analyzed the violent fantasies, key concept, a lot of fantasies going on, and found desperate minds that yearn for recognition. The fantasies often intensify over years before they're acted upon. They're often strengthened by a distorted sense of what is just or moral and the need to avenge a perceived offense. I can see this with all the gang violence, can't you? Somebody's done me wrong, and so now I need to avenge that. I can see that theme going on. Most teens are terrible at keeping secrets, and they begin to leak their plans to friends in chat rooms and even media outlets. Almost every one of us has imagined a vengeful scenario, even a murderous one, after frustrating experiences, according to research by psychologist David Buss at the University of Texas at Austin. Such fantasies, in a good way, can diffuse tension and thus might be considered cleansing. However, these thoughts may overwhelm an unbalanced mind. Signs of trouble that you should look for are being excessively introverted and lacking strong social attachments. Teens who saw or experienced violence themselves at a young age are very susceptible to intense, brutal fantasies, points out clinical psychologist Al Carlisle, who practices in Utah and has long studied serial killers and young violent criminals. Such experiences of having either seen or been violated can foster a belief that violence is the only way to gain recognition and respect. Thus, and this is going to be a key point of my talk today, the media attention showered on previous school shooters, such as Columbine killers Harris and Klebold, often appeals to the would-be copycats. The publicity may pass for ego-building esteem in their minds. After Columbine 1999 rampage, which left 13 dead and 24 injured, Harris and Klebold were on the covers of magazines and the front pages of newspapers for weeks. FBI interviews with imprisoned multiple murderers have shown that the violent fantasies gradually consume more space in their minds. Eventually, a dangerously violent vision dominates a teen's thoughts and just cries out for action. Teens sometimes state a desire to do it better than their predecessors, which generally means what? Killing more people. Jack Katz, a sociologist and violence researcher at UCLA, terms their rationalized fantasies as righteous slaughter. They feel they're doing a righteous thing. Schools are a natural target because teens experience the worst slights in school. Harris and Klebold, in their diaries, painted themselves as gods and wished to be feared. They wanted to become masters of life and death. Teachers, principals, and school psychologists are being trained to differentiate signs of serious trouble from ordinary teen rebellion. In order to determine student intentions, one who is, listen to this list because it's different than ordinary teen rebellion. One who is extremely interested in obtaining lots of guns, collects movies and posters of shooters, regularly visits fan websites for school shooters, or is a social loner, is likely to be in need of professional help. Other signs to look for: a troubled childhood, aggressive tendencies, a very impulsive approach to life, and somebody who hugely enjoys risk-taking. So here's some ideas for solution. I have lots. I'm only going to share 4 with you tonight, okay? First one, different type of solution than you might have heard before. Use technology to identify troubled students. Anonymous reporting systems, perhaps text-based messaging, can make it easier for parents and students to alert law enforcement and school counselors and school resource officers to teens who seem disconnected or disturbed. That enables early intervention, and I want you to know it works. Here's an example. In Steamboat Springs, Colorado, one such tip appeared to prevent extreme violence in May of 2017. Police took a young man who threatened to harm his peers into protective custody before he could act on his words. Yes. Number 2, the news media must take a stand. Focus less on the perpetrator and more on the unfolding of the deed less on the perpetrator and the deed and more on the consequences of the crime, the horrific consequences. And the last one I'm going to share with you tonight is school psychologists and social workers need to help disillusioned youth find respect. In one of the shooter's home videos, he talked about, "No one respected me." Schools should offer seminars that advise students on ways to discover their talents and interests and how to use them to earn admiration. Parents can help their teens find a job or activity in which they can learn to enjoy and excel. I have lots more to say, but I am going to give the other panelists a chance. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. All right. So I do want to actually ask a question, though, on this. You know, you referenced that when we see certain behavioral indicators, an example being they're visiting websites that you know are like fan-based websites for these shooters. So I'm not saying that you know school shooters visit fan-based websites, but other people visit fan-based websites and don't become school shooters. Somebody built this website and arguably didn't become a school shooter. So I think it's interesting that we look at some of the indices that you know starts to manifest with each one of these, and we obviously are always looking for commonality. You know, trying to find those things that could be you know pre-operational indicators. But by the same token, we also have to be cognizant that you know there's something else going on. When we have 45 people all looking at the same website, but only one of them becomes violent, it's got to be something beyond the website. It's got to be something endemic to them. Cosmo and I both went to the same undergraduate institution, but we went there for came there from very different areas. We went to the University of San Francisco, and for those of you who don't know, USF is a Jesuit institution. Now, Cosmo was already a Catholic when he ended up going to USF. I'm Jewish, so what in the world was I doing there? Okay, I actually grew up in a fairly secularized household. I didn't really have religion. The Jesuits were extraordinarily kind to me and provided me with a classical education that I will, to my dying day, be indebted for. Okay. One of the things that was also very fascinating, not growing up in a Catholic faith, not really growing up in a faith at all, but then being exposed to Jesuit Catholicism, created an academic interest in a multitude of faiths. And quite honestly, I think that tackling a problem of this magnitude without having a greater understanding of the faith-based realities involved is sort of missing the point. That's one of the reasons why I was so thrilled to have Jason in here. He understands Judeo-Christian philosophy a heck of a lot better than I do. So anyways, I'd like to turn this over to Jason.
Stephen, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. Truly blessed and looking forward to some lively conversation. Like Stephen said, not sure that we're going to come to any specific resolution, but at least we can be headed in the right direction. And with that, today's definition of truth is fluid, like a river. Today's truth is constantly changing, going with the flow of our own personal feelings. Today's truth winds through the canyons of our minds and is directed by winds of society. Absolute truth, however, is a rock, not a river. Truth does not change. Truth stands strong against the river of changing times. Society's truths crash against the rock of truth. Truth is absolute. We are all searching for truth, no doubt. Our kids are searching for truth. Kids feel secure with truth, with boundaries. With it, there is safety and security. This truth, however, has been dismissed, disregarded, and discarded. Discovering truth starts in the home. How do kids find it when no one is home? When no one has time? When parents are also focused on the world's changing truth? When the progressive breakdown of the family is difficult for kids to find? Can it be discovered in schools? In schools that are more worried about the fluctuating societal issues than the core of truth? In schools where they have lost the vision of education, instead now focus on the topic of social issues? In schools where they have demanded that absolute truth be removed? So what has changed? Absolute truth has been compromised and often completely removed from many families and most schools. Absolute truth has become unfair, too harsh, not sensitive enough. The truth guides us on a path that isn't always easy. The truth can make us uncomfortable, and we don't like that. Today, we want easy. We want comfortable. We want things. We simply want, and we're not willing to give. Our country was founded on truth, which is God's word. Our country was founded on biblical principles. This doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is Christian. The United States is called a Christian nation, however, because Christianity has largely shaped and molded our nation. This is evident in our history, in our founding legal documents, and truth has been compromised. George Washington said it well, quote, "It is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God and obey His will," end quote. Conveying biblical truth to today's youth paints a clear picture of right and wrong, while society's version of truth leaves children morally confused. This moral confusion is fatally dangerous and leads to our children's demise.
Thank you, Jason. I'm afraid to challenge you on that for the possible eternal consequences that I might deal with. Okay. So, Clayton, as you know, so Clayton, for those of you who don't know, Clayton is a member of the Orange County Sheriff's Department. He's an SRO. I think it's important to have a law enforcement perspective, especially in SRO. This is, as all of you know, there's been some massive controversy about the behavior of law enforcement following Parkland. Anyways, Clayton, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over.
Thank you. Yeah, good evening. Thanks for having me here. I was actually a former SRO. I've moved beyond that position. I've also been on our behavioral threat assessment team. I was SRO for a little over 3 years on the behavioral threat assessment team, and you know, in one school year, 185 days of school, I did 125 threat assessments. We have nearly 200 schools in the sheriff's jurisdiction. And what I learned was that the vast majority of the students we were talking to were frankly good kids who made a bad choice. Threats come from various places. Typically for most kids, it's really a threat reduction strategy, right? Like, so somebody's up in your face, you want them to back off, so you throw a threat at them and you're hoping that will cower them down. So that's the vast majority of the kind of things I was dealing with. But there were a handful that were absolutely on a path of violence. And over the last couple of years, I've been teaching behavioral threat assessment to law enforcement in schools up and down nationally, teaching classes for community, like for parents and students, what should you be looking for. Because when we look at something like Parkland, what we're really seeing is the perfect example of how there's so many, or at least there should be, various overlapping methods and entities that should really stop something like from happening, and every one of those broke down. And one thing I want to express to you guys tonight, and I try to make this really clear when I do my parent class, is that we can do something about this. That you don't have, you're not living in a world where you're just waiting, bracing for impact, waiting for something to happen. That there's actually things that we can do as parents, things that we can encourage our students to do, things that we can get and encourage and train the school staff and law enforcement to do, to really intercede and stop a student, or anybody, frankly, that's on a path of violence from ever committing violence in the first place. Because frankly, as soon as the first fire is shot, we're just cleaning up a mess, frankly, and we want to stop that from happening. The doctor over here, I think she did an excellent job kind of laying out really, you know, what is the path of violence. I mean, it really starts with an individual with a grievance. And in my class, I asked, you know, my students, I'm like, well, you know, if you parked your car and you were just an inch over into the red zone, you came out with a ticket, what would you do? And the class would say, well, we pay the ticket and move on. I go, what if you didn't want to do that? Well, we could fight it. Well, you fought it and you went all the way to the end. And finally, the judge said, you are guilty. What do you do now? And most people, healthy people, would say, I pay the fine and I move on. But for whatever reason, maybe it's because of mental health issues, or their life experiences and the current stress in their lives, or whatever it may be, they can't do that. They're grievance collectors. And they finally arrive to the conclusion that violence is the only way to address their grievance. It's about, and really all intended or predatory violence is trying to achieve justice in some way or another. So there is a very predictable and very observable path to violence. And I spent 8 hours talking to law enforcement about that, and there's a lot to be said about that. But we need to engage, especially students, because a lot of what's happening is happening through social media. And they're often the first ones to see this kind of thing happening with students, or the expression of a desire to commit violence, or a pattern of violent fantasies. They're usually the first one to see. We saw that with Nicholas Cruz in Parkland. So the anonymous texting, I set up anonymous texting, text-to-tip through most schools when I was the SRO about 5 years ago. And it's been an incredible tool for us, because the same reasons why students sometimes say inappropriate things online, because there's no one sitting right in front of them, and it takes away that inhibition. It also takes away the inhibition of feeling like you're snitching on someone. So we're kind of using technology and leveraging it in a positive way for them, because it's kind of tough if you're a student to walk into the principal's office and stand there in front of that principal, that authority figure, and say, I saw something and it's scary. So we really need to be looking for ways to do that. I don't know why. I mean, I can't honestly say why we're seeing more violence today with students than we have in the past, which it is perplexing. It's a complicated issue, so there's not going to be a simple one-answer solution. But clearly, it's not because we have more guns in the home. That's not true. We actually, I think statistically, there's fewer guns in the home than there used to be. We live in a safer society than we ever did. I mean, violent crime is lower than it's ever been. But I think Steve's right. I think there's a sense that there's a lack of connection between students, and that was one thing that with others, empathy. That was one thing that was noted in the State School Initiative, which was a study done after the Columbine. Was basically students who were involved in these shootings did not have a pro-social relationship with another adult in the school, and usually not with their parents either. And like again, that's not just that's not going to solve everything, but I mean, I guess we can go. I'll use up all the time, but there's more to be said about that, and maybe we can follow up with that. But children's brains are not biologically created at the time in their lives of between 15 and 25 to make good choices. The prefrontal cortex is not going to develop until maybe 25. After 16 years in law enforcement, some people never. It's called job security. We got a big concrete building full of them in Santa Ana that I used to supervise. The point is that that coupled with undiagnosed mental health issues, the lack of connectivity to other people, pro-social experiences, the rise of anxiety and depression in children since 2010 when we gave them mobile devices and they started using that as their primary way of connecting with other human beings. I think it's a bunch of different things. I think, again, parents, there are things that we can do in our home to impact those issues. So, and that's another thing that I talk about, so we'll talk about that.
Excellent, Clint. Thank you very much. So I do want to actually touch on something that you said there, Clayton. So you said that there seems to be a lack, for one of the things that seems to be sort of predominant with all of these school shooters is a lack of trust in the system. And you quoted, all predatory violence is an attempt at justice. And I think that's actually very present. It's not something that I had ever really given great concern to. Francis Fukuyama, a philosopher, wrote a book in the late 1980s, early 1990s called Trust. And the whole premise of the book is that for a society to function and to function efficiently, there has to be an underlying trust. Otherwise, if there's no trust between individuals, you can't lend money. If I don't know that you're going to be able to actually pay me back this money, or I don't trust that you're going to be able to pay me back this money, I'm not going to extend credit. Industry doesn't establish, you don't have a thriving economy. Where we have a backstop to the lack of trust is a court system. All right, if I might not trust you, but at least we have a contract. And if we've got this contract, if things go sideways, then I can always rely on the courts to be able to get this. But when we have a lack of trust in the courts, we have a lack of trust in society at all. And one of the things that as you were talking, I was really starting to think about, if you look at the movies, especially the cop movies, when I was a kid, cop movies all had a very specific theme. You had good cops and you had bad guys that the good cops were going after. I wanted to be a cop because of these types of movies. Starting in the 1980s, maybe, all the way up through to present day, what is the ongoing theme of every single cop movie? The cop that's the main hero is an aggrieved character, right? He's always being screwed by his supervisors. And what do we know about his supervisors? They're criminals. They're always on the take. They're in league with the underworld. They're conspiring to keep him down. He's ultimately able to persevere, and these guys end up going to jail. But what do we see pervasive of this entire methodology? That the criminal justice system is fundamentally corrupt. And you have these kids growing up. We're focused on these video games that we're going to talk to Rob about here in a little bit. But what about our popular culture that extends beyond video games? You have the same trope coming out. You have these kids growing up with a belief system that authority figures are fundamentally dishonest. And if they're not dishonest, then they're effectively ineffectual. So I believe that that's going to have a play. And if you have an individual who feels legitimately aggrieved, your parking ticket analogy was perfect, feels legitimately aggrieved, and at the end of this appellate process still has to pay the ticket, and feels that the entire thing was a sham, what's the next course of action? Why does a terrorist use violence? Because they've made the determination that violence is the most effective means of obtaining a political objective. What are these killers? They're terrorists. They're using violence to achieve a political objective. They're not trying to free or liberate an entire class of individuals. They're trying to liberate themselves. Okay. What do you think? Does that sound pretty good? Yeah, there you go. All right. All right, Kendra, your thoughts.
All right, so as Steve already mentioned, my father is in the audience here, and he's hard of hearing, so I should have a loud enough voice for sure for all of you guys to hear me, right? Am I good in the back? Okay. Oh, really? You still can't hear? All right, maybe I'll come.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right, so I teach American government for a living, and I feel like 80% of the time that I spend in the classroom lecturing is time spent criticizing the government and talking about all the things that are wrong with our society. So before I talk about some of the things that I want to add to, the other panelists have already talked about the causal mechanisms, the reasons why mass shootings at schools have risen, I do want to give you guys some good news, or maybe even challenge your perception of how big this particular problem is. Because I would argue that human beings, we tend to be irrational in terms of the way that we perceive our fears, right? So only 1 in 11,125 people here in the United States are expected to die in a mass shooting. And this is based upon 2017 statistics, right? One of the worst years when it came to mass shootings. While 1 out of every 491 people in the United States can expect to die in a car accident. You're also more likely to die from choking on food or drowning than you are to die in a mass shooting accident. So I would argue that it might even be a luxury that we're able to have this conversation, right? I don't want you to misunderstand me though. This is absolutely a problem. However, the problem may not seem as significant as we perceive it because of the fact that this is what we're talking about all the time. This is what the media is covering. And because of that, I think that our perceptions of the dangers are a little bit misconstrued, right? So I think a lot of the panelists already talked about the increase or the rise of rates of anxiety or depression amongst young people in this particular society. And I really want to underline, this isn't my phone, but I'm going to steal it from you for a second. This is our biggest problem right here. There's an article that was published in the Atlantic magazine a couple months ago, and it was titled, How the iPhone Ruined a Generation. Now, I'm technically a millennial. Anybody that was born from 1984 or my significant other is in the back, he's shaking his head. He doesn't like to be a millennial, all right, because everybody talks crap on us. But I'm technically a millennial, right? So anybody that was born from about 1983 to 2000 is a millennial. But if you have a teenager at home that was born after 2000, they are of the I generation. That's the name that we gave them because this technology has so significantly changed their lives. And what the Atlantic article talked about is that we've seen rates of anxiety and depression significantly increase amongst our teens, and it's because of their screen time. Teenagers now they spend the least amount of time with their peers than at any other point we have been able to document. They are the least likely out of any generation to go out on a date. Female teenagers are now 2 times more likely to kill themselves, and male teenagers are now 3 times more likely to kill themselves. And I can tell you from my firsthand experience that I started teaching at Saddleback College I'm sure many of you guys are familiar with Saddleback. I started teaching there 5 years ago, and my very first day as a professor, I walked in, everybody was chit-chatting with one another, everybody became close friends, and there was great camaraderie in my classroom. There was a sense of belonging, there was a sense of community in my classroom. And now when I walk into my classroom, I see this. I literally have to strong arm my students into talking with one another and building relationships with one another. They don't know how to interact with each other anymore. They're afraid to speak up. They're afraid to talk. And so beyond that, I want to make a related argument that I think that the rates of anxiety and depression moving beyond social media and the iPhone relate to the economy as a whole. So I want to even point to 2008 and put a little bit of blame on 2008. And again, I'm going to talk about millennials. Millennials, if you're 29 years old here in the US today, the median income of a 29-year-old is only $39,000 a year. Only about 25% of millennials own homes, and very few of them actually have even finished college. So the average millennial, believe it or not, the most educated generation, has not finished college. So I think that a lot of the anxiety and a lot of the depression amongst our teenagers and our young adults, right, has to do with this lack of belonging or sense of purpose within our socioeconomic system, right? So when I went to elementary school, I was told that as long as I went to college, I was going to do well in the world. And now I'm 27 years old, and I have almost a PhD, and I live at home with my parents because I can't afford to live in South Orange County. And so the I generation, the Parkland shooter, right, and some of these other school shooters, they are a part of this cohort. For the first time, we cannot expect to do as well as our parents did. And so there's this, like, we have access to all the resources in the world. Everybody's told us that we're special. Everybody's told us that as long as we work hard, we can achieve anything. But at the end of the day, the jobs aren't there. And oftentimes, jobs give us a sense of purpose. Another thing that I want to underline, my last point, is if you look at a list of all the mass shootings that have occurred in the last decade or so, you'll see that all of them they're typically Caucasian, and they're always male. So why is it that it's only men that are engaging in mass shootings or committing mass shootings? There was a fantastic opinion article published in the New York Times a couple weeks ago after the Parkland shooting, and the argument was this. The argument was that the United States has a gender problem. And we tell our boys, we tell our sons that they are supposed to be masculine. They are supposed to be men, right? And so the argument is that we, unlike Western Europe, right, we still purport this sort of like sense of hypermasculinity, and we impose those norms and those stereotypes on our men. So talking about grievances, that need to, get revenge. I would argue that maybe some of our young men just don't have the ability to cope for whatever reason, right? And it could be that we've taught them to repress those emotions and those feelings. So that's another thing that I think we should consider. And then just one little last note, my experiences as a professor, I've noticed that my students over the last couple of years demonstrate a lack of resiliency. And it could be that when we have children now, we only have a few of them, right? So those children that we have, we put all of our resources and we put all of our expectations into them. And so children, right, feel like they have to be perfect, right? And so when they fail, or they try something and they're not successful, it's like it shatters their entire world. So that's what I found. I've had more students, you know, break down and have an anxiety attack in front of me, crying or pleading to me for a better grade than I have in all of my years of teaching put together just within the last couple of months. So I've noticed this change in the I generation, and it's significant. So maybe that's a question that we need to sort of pose to ourselves is why don't our kids have a sense of resiliency anymore? And maybe it's because we force teachers into giving A's. I certainly feel that way sometimes. But it could be for another wide set of, or a variety of reasons. Okay, so I'll stop there, and I won't take up all this time.
Thank you, Kendra. I think it was excellent. So I do want to expand on a couple of things. So actually, and I'm not using it in a pejorative term, but you know, sort of a Marxist idea that you know lack of economic opportunity and it creates this you know internal conflict and social discord and stuff like that. I think there's actually a lot of validity to that. I've always thought, in fact, if we look at social movements throughout really all of human history, there tends to be an economic calculation associated with that, whether it's the disruptive nature of you know industrialization or the I generation, as you articulated it. There's always going to be that disruptive characteristic. What is interesting is that in Western society, in our society, nobody, for the most part, starves. We don't have the types of economic pressures that we did, say, 100 years ago. We don't have the types of medical issues that we did, say, 100 years ago. I'm a diabetic. I'm a type 1 diabetic. 100 years ago, I would have died. I wouldn't be here tonight. Okay, so modern technology has allowed us to continue to evolve, and yet, with this, you know, we're using sort of a Maslow scale. We've gotten up to this idea of self-actualization and empowerment, and that doesn't seem to be enough. I think you do have a very valid point with that, Kendra. What's interesting is that we're arguing from a totally different level now. The other one has to do with toxic masculinity, which I thought was really interesting because you're absolutely correct. What did we see with the Columbine killers back in the 1990s? They wanted to kill the jocks. They felt as though they were the ones who were victims. We could talk about effeminization and everything else, but they felt that they were the victims. What have we seen over the last 20 years, on the other hand, with the development of males? We now see a feminized male, and again, I'm not using that in a pejorative term, it's more empirical, all right? The self-identification as bisexual and everything else in our youth has changed, different from when we were, say, 50 years ago. I'm not sure that there is a disconnect, because when we look at popular culture, when we look at the essential world of academia, that type of self-identification and non-binary statuses, this is celebrated. This isn't looked at as being a negative. It was in the movie, which some of you that have more baser levels of humor probably watched. What was it? It was the movie where they go back to school as they're cops, but they go back to school. Jump Street, 21 Jump Street, the second 21 Jump Street, where they went back to high school, and the main character was going to become the alpha male. He was going to, you know, get himself into the society so that they could find out where the drugs were coming by. And his first action was to try to beat up what he thought was the current alpha male. And everybody was like, "Oh man, you're a jerk. I can't believe you did that." And they were looking and his mentality from the 1980s was that this is the way you would achieve a social status. Now it was seen as a joke. Right? Now we were going to be completely inclusive, and in reality, the kid that normally would have been aggravated back 30 years ago was now seen as at the top of the social pyramid. So I think there's been a shift. I think there's been a legitimate shift. While I think that that type of social pressure answers the question 30 years ago or 20 years ago, I'm not sure it does today. I think there's more of a change going on, at least in certain sectors. Maybe in urban areas, I think I might have a point. I think in like true suburban areas, more rural communities, places like that, that may still have a lot of validity too, Kendra. But regardless, thank you very much. All right, now from a youth teacher's perspective, Kendra's in college. Now from the high school perspective, Ryan.
Am I loud enough? Is this okay?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you all for being here tonight. I think it speaks highly of you that you're taking such an interest in this. It's obviously something that's very important to you. Along with being a classroom teacher day to day, I have a lot of other kind of aspects to my job. And one of my job is I get to make everybody else angry when I tell them all the things that they thought were going to work didn't work. Because they'll want to institute some new plan. They're going to say, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And so then, as part of the leadership team on the school campus, I say, okay, so how are we going to measure the success of this? And when are we going to evaluate it? And what measures are we going to look at to see if what we're actually doing is effective? And we try a lot of different stuff, and sometimes it works, most of the time it doesn't, and everybody gets really upset when I say, this is what we agreed on, we didn't get anywhere near what we were trying to accomplish, we need to try something else, because this didn't work. And everybody gets really mad at me. Part of that's just because of my background. I got my physics degree, so I'm a scientist. I'm used to looking at all the data that I can possibly get my hands on, and hopefully from that, making an informed decision. And I don't really care how that makes people feel. It's a gift.
We should hire him for our firm, Cosmo.
I was really grateful to be asked here tonight, and when I saw the topic, my first thought was, just again from my science background, if you really want to know why the kids are killing, they will tell you. If you find yourself sleeping too soundly and you just wake up and you're too well rested and nothing is really bothering you at night, you can go home and you can look at Eric Harris's diary entries, and it is very chilling stuff. It will make you think about some of the things that you kind of take for granted. I don't recommend doing that. Get all the sleep you can. But they will tell you exactly why they've gone and done what they've done. The deeper question and the tougher question, I think one of the reasons we're here tonight, is try and figure out, well, how did it get that far? And there's failures on multiple levels when you see those real tragic events like what happened in Parkland or Sandy Hook or Columbine or wherever that is. There's so many things that didn't go the way we want them to go when something terrible like that happens. Personally, I think that if somebody tries to tell you, well, none of this would have happened if the kids didn't have access to firearms, I think personally that's a very shallow answer. And my response to that is because right now the second leading cause of death in our adolescents is suicide. And just in the Saddleback Valley Unified School District alone, that's very close to where we are right now, there are a lot of incidences of suicide. Just earlier this year, there was a poor girl in junior high school who ended her life by hanging herself in a public park. And it's a terrible thing and it's a tragic thing, and I cannot for the life of me figure out why someone who is that young has decided to give up on what, for all intents and purposes, is pretty great. When I was driving here tonight, one of the things that I've noticed just in general from talking to students over the years is a complete lack of gratitude just for the things that we have that are available to us right now. It's beautiful every day. Like, we walk outside, the sky is blue, the weather is nice, and a lot of that gets taken for granted. There's things that the young people today, I still marvel at the fact that people walked on the moon. and that we can land little robots on Mars. I think stuff like that is incredible, and I try to, you know, impart that incredulity to a lot of my students. And I always like to use the example that they just kind of, every little picture that they see of the solar system is from their textbook. And if you had to actually make a model, a scale model of the solar system, there's a quote from one of the Apollo 11 astronauts that when they were out there, they look back at the Earth and they see the Earth as the size of their thumbnail. So if the Earth is the size of your thumbnail and you want to make a scale model of the solar system, how much space do you need? The short answer is you need to go out to the Black Rock Desert because you need 7 miles of empty space. And in order to get from the Earth to Mars in that 7 miles of empty space, and that how much nothing is out there, is a really incredible thing. And our kids look at that and they just look at it as something that's like, Neil Armstrong was the first man to walk on the moon, blah, 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 blah. And that doesn't excite them. They're not, they're not intrigued by that. They don't understand what a miracle that was, that he landed on the moon and we brought him back. So when those tragic events happen, like I said, there's failures on multiple levels. There's instances where you can point to where schools as an institution has failed, where public education isn't doing all the things that it can do, especially for boys in general, right? I read an article, and I think the quote in there was that, especially in the elementary school, elementary schools treat boys like broken girls. It's like, you need to sit down, you need to be quiet, you need to do this, you need to read this book. And I'm like, I was a little boy, I wanted to do none of those things. We've cut back on the amount of time that they can spend outside. We've cut back on their rough and tumble play. We've cut back on books that are actually interesting for boys to read, as opposed to all the books that they read in high school. And I think one of the biggest tragedies is I left high school hating to read. I didn't like it at all because of all the books that I read. And The Scarlet Letter, you might like it, you might love it, they still teach in high school. The trials and tribulations of a puritanical woman who committed adultery did not appeal to me as a young adolescent boy. I had a hard time relating. And it wasn't until I got into college and I started reading all the really good books that are out there that I found things that fit my interests. And it took me a long time to actually enjoy reading, but that's just one of the things that, if you have kids, if you have children of your own, that's one of the things that you can make sure that they're doing, that they make sure that they're getting enough exercise. The state of California only requires for a high school diploma that they have 2 years of PE. And just as an FYI, you can get those taken care of if you sign up for power walking as an elective. I don't think that's going to meet your needs to go get enough exercise, right? The state of California only requires 8 hours of community service for a high school diploma. I did 40 because where I grew up, the district themselves had a higher standard. But our students right now, they're not connecting with all the other things and all the other, they're not making use of all the other opportunities that are available to them. And a lot of those kids who, I have seniors right now and I have to deliver notices, they're getting ready to graduate, they're not going to walk at graduation because 8 hours of community service has been too much and they've been putting it off for 4 years and they still haven't done it. And a lot of the kids who graduate, they're getting their 8 hours signed off because they went and helped file papers at their dad's office. Those are just some of the things, like I said, there's different things, but a lot of it leads to, I think what Stephen mentioned, just an overall lack of empathy, which I see as just a complete disconnectedness from the other people around them. They just don't have any kind of interest. They're very lackadaisical about their own futures or any of that other stuff. And they can't, they're teenagers, so they can't think that far ahead anyway. But they should be able to think farther ahead than, the time that they have to get to lunch. So.
Excellent, right. Very, very good. So, interesting connectivity here. So, you have an individual who is lacking empathy as just based on his own personal biology. And Grandra, I would absolutely agree with you, with the exception of an outlier up in, the computer company up there, almost all mass shooters have been men or boys. Okay. So there definitely seems to be something to deal with the maleness here. You've got a basic belief understanding that the system has utterly failed or does not apply to you. What is being provided is pablum or comic at best. I think your analysis of the Scarlet Letter was spot on. Okay. And honestly, to somebody who's predisposed to believe that the system is fundamentally corrupt and does not apply to them, something like that is ad absurdum. Why am I sitting here listening to this guy, especially when I have access to, as Kendra mentioned, this communicative device that allows me to operate from a disassociative standpoint and be able to communicate with people that I've never been able to see before, and to be able to say things almost in a confessional note. That's one of the things that we've seen before too. All of these killers like to brag about what they're going to do on some form of social media. And we have to be vigilant to that. Now, one thing that we have seen argued multiple times, really throughout the last probably 10 years, is that video games are the training tools that kids are being groomed on to kill other kids. Yeah, well, maybe a little bit longer than that. Most of you that have been here to Artemis know that we use simulators. And these simulators, a lot of times people would come to us as part of our business model and they would say to Sandy, you know what, Sandy, you could make a lot more money if you would allow people to come in, pay 20 bucks, give them a gun, and let them go onto the simulator by themselves and effectively self-educate. Whether it's marksmanship or running simulations or doing things like that. Effectively turning this into a video game. And Sandy's response was, no way in hell. We'll close down before we ever allow that to happen. We are taking individuals, we're putting them on training systems, and to not have the eyeballs of an instructor watching them for proper use, watching them for judgmental use of force, watching them to ensure gun safety so that there's no development of negative training scars. And frankly, watching them to make sure that the individual that's out there isn't a nut job that might be training to go out and shoot up a mall. There's a safety protocol involved in this too. Video games, for the most part, with the exception of the networked ones, are highly solitary experiences between one individual and his own computer screens. One of the things that we have seen is that virtually every single active killer has played violent video games. Now, this is supposed to be a statistic that is supposed to make us sit back in awe and think, aha, there it is, we found it. This is the causal connection. Well, here's the thing. Every single active killer at one point or another has drank a Diet Coke. We got to get that off the shelf. Every single active killer at one point or another has driven in a vehicle. So there must be some sort of causal connection. I'm not saying that there isn't. What I'm saying is that from an anecdotal level, we have to go a lot deeper than that. Now, we asked Phil. Phil's an interesting individual. Phil, you might be surprised to know this. Most video game manufacturing companies, where all the artists are that are developing all this content, they're not filled with a bunch of gun-crazy guys that are looking to, make the most realistic shooting experience possible. Actually, most of them are decidedly anti-Second Amendment. Phil happens to employ a lot of them. And Phil oftentimes leaves his place of employment and comes over to Artemis to sit down so he can detox around us. All right? So it's a real gift to be able to have somebody from that industry to talk about it. Phil.
All right. So it's funny, I was asking a couple of the guys here who they thought would get the most abuse tonight when it came to the question and answer portion. And I still think it's going to be me, but maybe not. Maybe you guys will see.
Phil, you want to come up here?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
So yeah, to repeat that, I was asking a couple of the guys who they thought was going to get the most abuse from the audience tonight. Like I said, I thought it was going to be me. I don't know, we'll see. So when I sat down to think about this, right, I mean, this is something that I've thought about a lot because it's my business, right, and I also have 2 young boys, 11 and 13, right, who are big, obviously, video game players, which, you know, I think is awesome, right, something I can share with them. But, you know, I've come to some interesting realizations for that, and I'll sort of get into them. But I've got sort of 3 sections that I wanted to cover. One is the first one, right, is what is driving our kids to kill. So the first thing I thought about was, you know, okay, why do we lash out, right? I mean, at some point in our lives, we've all gotten really pissed off about something and lashed out, whether it be punching somebody, you know, throwing something against the wall, punching the wall, screaming, whatever, right? And so, you know, I started doing a little bit of research about this, and I think, you know, at least in the times, you know, when I remember when I was a young man, you know, the times when I lashed out was when I felt threatened, desperate, and I think a big one was sort of powerless, like not in control of my own destiny. I was reading an article in Psychology Today, and the gist of the article was that people want to be effective, right? That it's sort of a human need to be an effective human being. And when our goals are thwarted, we become highly motivated that we can still produce results. So, you know, basically their summation was, and I'll read it to you, it said, in short, frustrated people may have an urge to do something effectively, whether it makes someone else's day better or worse. They don't care, right? Because at that point they're so frustrated, you know, because they're not effective. And I think there's some truth to that. Now, when I think of young people, you know, I think of, okay, they're already experiencing these sort of intense hormonal changes. Their brains are not fully developed, as a couple of you have already said, right? That's something that I tell some of the younger guys that I work with all the time. Look, you're not 25, your brain's still, your brain's still messed up, dude. You know, and they tend to lead with their emotions, right? Because the prefrontal cortex, I think is what you said, is not developed, right? I think the part that sort of fills in is the emotional centers. So, you know, essentially they aren't great at cause and effect computations, and frankly, they suck at risk management. Now, one of the things, you know, everyone asks, what's different? Well, I mean, a lot of it, I think, is technology. I mean, when we talk about the phone, right, that's a big one. But, you know, so in this world that keeps getting more complex, right, I mean, we are bombarded with so much information every day. Like, I had to like really curtail my phone usage because I read the news constantly, and it's incredibly frustrating and distressing, and I'll go home in a bad mood because of all the crap that I've read on the news, right? So we're constantly bombarded with this stuff, and I know kids are no different, right? They're on the screens more than most of us. They see a hostile world, right? If you look at social media, I think it'd be hard to deny that, you know, we're pretty hostile towards each other online. You know, and this stuff is really difficult to navigate. So, I mean, my question, the question that I'll ask, and I guess it's a hypothetical question and one that maybe you'll answer, is it possible that people, young people, whoever, even older people, right, with limited coping mechanisms, a lack of guidance or support systems, and, you know, that might just be mentally compromised, lash out and attempt to show the world and themselves that they can still produce results, that they can do something effectively, right? I don't know. I mean, it might not be solely the reason, but I think maybe that's a big part of it, right? I mean, we've all, you know, most of us are able to handle that stress, right? And, you know, maybe for some of us that's, I double down and I work harder, right? I think most of us can't, but for somebody that has gotten to the point where they have no hope, right? I mean, Kendra talked about a lot of these kids, right, that just, they're not engaged, right? And you know, both of our teacher representatives, they're not engaged, right? They don't have anything, they don't think they have anything to live for. I mean, when you think about Nicholas Cruz, right, both of his adopted parents were dead, right? I mean, the kid was bullied, right? And I don't try to paint him as a victim, right? Because, you know, he was messed up and did something horrible. But I can't help feeling like, you know, when somebody gets to that point, you're going to have some individuals that will just snap. So, so then the next thing I asked, okay, how can we stop it? I mean, hell if I know, I wish I did know. But I think, you know, and this is one of, like, I grew up playing video games, right? I mean, I had the first Pong machine, right? I played them my entire life, right? I mean, I played Cowboys and Indians. We went outside and shot each other with our BB guns. You know, did all kinds of stupid boy shit, right? And, you know, I have no desire to shoot up anybody, right? Other than maybe somebody that's attacking me and, you know, coming after my family. But what I did have is I had reliable support systems, right? My family, a big one, right? My moral guidance as a kid, right? So, I mean, my folks were very religious. Now, I'm not religious, but my folks, you know, there was still sort of that strong Judeo-Christian sort of like right or wrong, you know, ethic kind of thing in our family. And I think that was helpful, right? So I think having those two things would be a good start. But one of the things that I think is very disturbing that I see is that a lot of people want this to come from the government, right? The government's got to do something, right? And that scares the shit out of me, right? Because I think that our support systems need to come from the people that we care about and from whom we want validation, right? This is family, friends, the church, if that's, you know, sort of in your life. These are good, caring people that you are connected with and you care what they think about. It can't come from the government, right? The government gravitates towards overly simple blanket solutions, right, to very complex problems. These problems are nuanced, right? And government solutions tend to be cold and personal, and they lack nuance, right? They usually end up being overly broad, very invasive, and ultimately, you know, I think as we see every day, ineffective. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, if we go back to, you know, when I say what's driving our kids to kill, and that is indeed sort of a lack of this feeling of effectiveness, right? I mean, if it's a human need, if agency is a human need, right? Government doesn't do that. Government takes away agency, typically, right? I mean, that's a broad brush statement, but, and, you know, if we need agency, the government regulation isn't going to help us. It's just going to make things worse. So we all want to be effective, not control. The last part that I want to cover is, you know, the reason why I'm here. It's the video game factor, right? So, you know, I hear this all the time. I've been hearing it since the early 90s, right? Video games are the problem, right? They're fucking up our kids' minds. Sorry for the swear word. I've been trying real hard.
That's all right. You're doing a good job.
I hang out with a bunch of game developers all day. We are an unruly bunch. Yeah, I mean, I don't think video games are the problem, and you know, and I'll talk a little bit about why. I know that you know a lot of the people that I see that are very critical of video games tend to, one, not be gamers, and two, not really know much about games at all, right? And I think history has shown us, and it's pretty much undisputable that people fear what they don't understand. How many people here play games? Do we have gamers in the crowd? Nice. Kids that play games? Cool. I just wanted to point out that I put together a handout. Maybe some of you grabbed it on the way in. It's basically, it covers some of what you were talking about with the cybersecurity and stuff like that. I put a bunch of links on there that will lead you to sites where you can look at like game reviews that are basically written for parents. You know, so for example, the most recent game, God of War, that just came out, is like selling like hotcakes, getting great reviews. Not a game for your kids, right? And it drives me crazy because, you know, as a game developer, I know this, right? And my kids don't get to play everything, and it drives them crazy. Right? Dad, you make video games. Why can't I play Grand Theft Auto? I'm like, I'm sorry, guys, but you know, I mean, if you have the handout there and you look at the bottom, the bottom rating thing. The big M, and then it's got the description right next to it. That's Grand Theft Auto's description, right? And could you read it out loud real quick? Sure.
Mature. Content is generally suitable for ages 17 and up. May contain intense violence, blood, gore, sexual content, and strong language. Okay.
That's good.
Mature 17 says intense violence, blood and gore, nudity, mature humor, strong language, strong sexual content, use of drugs and alcohol.
That game is not for the kids, right? And you know, a lot of us that, you know, aren't really into games don't seem to understand that games aren't just for kids anymore. In fact, quite the opposite, right? As, you know, somebody who's been doing this for almost a quarter century, I can tell you that most of the games that are developed for adults, right? Because, you know what? Adults have the most disposable income, right? And we're a business. We want to make money, right? And so we're not, there are games out there for kids, right? And, you know, but you can't let your kids play Grand Theft Auto. I mean, you can, but, you know, so when my kid comes and asks me, he's like, Dad, why can't I play Grand Theft Auto? Owen gets to play. I'm like, does Owen's parents know what is in that game? Right? Probably not. Right? And I hesitate, right, because when I talk to these parents, I'm like, I want to tell them, guys, you kids shouldn't be playing this game, right? I mean, I could give you an anecdotal, or, you know, something that is in Grand Theft Auto. There's a part where you can find, basically it's a strip club that's in the city. And you can go in, and you can sit down and you can get a lap dance, right? And there's a mini game that's associated with this, where the stripper will come over and sit on your lap and wiggle around like, you know, happens in a strip club. And the mini game is that you can feel up the stripper, but you need to stop doing it whenever the bouncer walks by, because if he sees you, he'll toss you off. I mean, that's in the game, right? That's for adults, right? Now you could say it's crazy, right? And we see much worse in movies, right? But again, this is a game that is developed for adults, not for kids. I got on a bit of a side there. Okay, so I guess the point there is that, you know, I don't think video games are necessarily the problem, but it doesn't mean that parents don't need to monitor the content of the games, because, you know, each one of these games that has a rating is meant for a different demographic. And I believe one of the reasons that video games are so popular is essentially what they do is they provide a consequence-free place where you can be presented with challenges, overcome them, and be successful. And you're rewarded for doing well in video games, right? And it feels good to win, right? I mean, that's why people like video games. That's why I play them. That's why my kids play them. And the thing is, again, going back to that drive to be effective, right? In this complicated, sort of challenging world, isn't it nice to just sit down and play a video game where you can step on Goomba heads all night, right? And get a high score, and it's fun, and I felt like I accomplished something. So yeah, I don't believe that video games make people violent. And honestly, I mean, you can look it up, and Laura will back me up on this. There has been no research that has definitively proved that there's any link between violent behavior and video games. Now, you don't want to let your 5-year-old play GTA. You know, don't do that. But it doesn't surprise me that, you know, when they say, again, you say a lot of these kids that shoot up schools and stuff like that play video games. That doesn't surprise me at all, because if indeed these kids feel disaffected, right, they don't have any sort of, you know, they're not effective human beings, well, of course they're going to play games, because that's a real easy way to just get in and feel like you can do something right. Yeah, I mean, that's about all I got.
All right, Phil, excellent. Excellent. All right. So Phil brought something up that I want to touch on really quick before we turn this over to general questions from you guys. Said I don't like the idea of government control, that when the government does something, when it regulates something, when it creates some sort of laws or something like that, it tends to do so with an overbroad brush. It's a hammer. It's not subtle, and this requires a high degree of subtlety, and I could not agree with him more. All right? The government is a sledgehammer to a problem that oftentimes requires fine precision tools. Now, to give you an understanding of my background, I'm a libertarian. I believe in fundamental limited government. So through that paradigm, you have to understand where I'm coming from with this. There are two types of laws that exist in the criminal world. They're what we refer to as malum in se and malum prohibitum. And Cosmo and I have had this discussion a number of times. A malum in se law means that you do not need to be told that this conduct is bad. Moral relativism notwithstanding, any normal functioning human being should be able to wake up in the morning and know that it is inappropriate and antisocial behavior to take a chainsaw to their neighbor's face. You don't need to be told that that's illegal. A malum prohibitum rule requires actual knowledge that something is in fact bad, that you wouldn't have a priori knowledge. An example would be the yellow lines in the street. Right? If you haven't been taught how to drive, if you haven't been given instructions on how to operate a vehicle, and you happen to just look down in the street and see these yellow lines, it would never occur to you that you're not allowed to drive on one side versus the other. You have to be instructed that that's bad. It's not bad because it's gestalt bad. It's bad because somebody decided to make it bad. You cannot prevent a malum in se violation by crafting malum prohibitum rules. If I'm going to kill somebody, you cannot say, yes, but you may not jaywalk before you commit that murder. If I got it in my mind that I'm going to kill somebody, I am going to be more than happy to jaywalk before committing that murder. Dianne Feinstein had made an interesting argument. Back about 10 years ago, there was a movement to create what is effectively a national reciprocity for concealed carry. Her argument was that a citizen of Nevada that has a concealed carry permit, who also happens to have an estranged wife living in California, if concealed carry reciprocity goes through, then this individual in Nevada may end up carrying his gun into California and then murdering his wife. And that's why we should not have national reciprocity. Now think about that for a second. I was going to kill my wife, but then I found out that it was a misdemeanor to carry a firearm, so I decided not to do it. All right? It's pure absurdity. And yet, we craft these laws in order to prevent these violent effects from taking place. That's a natural human inclination. I actually don't blame legislatures for doing this. However, if we are going to have a collectivist, expansive government, then we have to understand that this is a naturally occurring phenomenon. If a problem manifests, somebody's going to try to politically capitalize on that. And the only way that a politician can politically capitalize on a problem is to regulate that problem. And the only people who will follow the regulations to that problem will be the law-abiding citizens who would never commit the malum in se offense in the first place. That's the vicious circle. And then, and for those of us that are passionately afraid of tyranny, we have a disarmed society, and we are put into a place where we have no defense against tyranny. I'll leave you with those thoughts. All right, that being said, we had some excellent articulations by our presenters, all of them today. You guys now have the opportunity to put them on the hot seat. Do any of you have questions for any of these guys up here? Or was there anything that you guys would like to have a greater clarification? I saw one hand back here, sir.
I actually live in the greater Detroit area. We make Chicago look good. It's a war zone. But I don't really distinguish too much between a mass shooting and killing 2 or 3 kids. What I'm interested in, by the way, thank you so much for an insightful, and incisive analysis. It was splendid.
Thank you, guys.
I don't really think you touched on something that we see all of the time, and that is that our jails are 60 to 70% full of men who have no fathers in the home, never had fathers in the home. There is a direct correlation between dysfunctional families and involvement in the criminal justice system. In fact, I would suggest to you that it is the most not only correlative but causative factor that is involved here today. And so this is really addressed to, I suppose, Dr. Cheng. And by the way, many of these shooters, especially what you call mass shooters, are on SSRIs. As you know, there is a substantial majority, and it's in the documented literature. So, may I call you Dr. Riddell?
Yeah, Laura. And you can call me Laura, or you can call me Mrs. Riddell, but I'm not a doctor.
Mrs. Riddell. Of the students that you treat have anger management and impulse control problems, how many of them come from dysfunctional families where you don't have a father in the home that can instill discipline? Because that's something that we really see. How many of you have ever been to Detroit or Chicago in the inner cities? Anybody? Afghanistan and Kabul look good. There are bullet holes in many of the houses. Shootings occur every single day, and they are from those kinds of families, unfortunately.
You have the same conditions right here in Southern California.
Oh, believe me, you don't.
Detroit's worse. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm sure there's some bad places down in the LA area. I'm sure there is. But the entire city. You
know, if I could jump on it, because you just said something that I think was really interesting when you talk about fathers not being present. And like any generalization, you know, there's obviously children that have grown up, but with widowed mothers that are completely functional, everything else. But when you do look at mega data, that definitely seems to be an ongoing theme. And what's fascinating is when we take that and we compare it to the military. One of the things that we see in the military is that you take children that come from a variety of different socioeconomic backgrounds, come from different levels of parenting, come from different levels of abuse, and everything else, and we take these people and we put them through massive, rigorous discipline. We tell these individuals that they are going to be given weapon systems that will be utilized to destroy other human beings. And then we expect that we're going to take these same individuals and 4 to 6 years later put them back into society where they will become functioning members of an American economic class. Now, that sounds insane, and yet, for the most part, most of these soldiers rotate into the real world and they're completely functional individuals, having committed unknown numbers of acts of violence overseas. What's the common factor, though, with these soldiers? They're put under rigorous discipline. When I first started drilling, especially as an officer, it seemed unbelievably insane to me. Why is a lawyer having to sit there and march around with other lawyers? This seems absolutely ludicrous. And yet, there's absolute value to this. Because we're taking an individual and we're giving it absolute base level discipline. This is what you are going to do under these confined schedules. Violence is sometimes sanctioned, but only under these confined schedules. Take that individual and don't put him into that level of confinement, like in Detroit, where suddenly, rather than having a drill instructor giving him very specific guidelines of when the rules of engagement are acceptable, instead he says, here's a 9mm, go knock off a liquor store. When violence becomes an active part of daily life without having the rigors and structure, the customs and courtesies of a military engagement, you then have an inevitable conclusion. A kid who ultimately kills a bunch of people and then is killed by another kid.
I mean, you're absolutely right. Just, by the way, so as not to be pejorative, Dr. Ben Carson grew up in one of those houses.
Absolutely, yeah.
In Detroit, so that we all recognize it may not be totally causative. So, Laura, would you like to respond?
I have a comment to his question. Okay, his question was how many of the students that I treat would come from a home like this with no fathers. And I wanted to give him an example. When I started my career as a school psychologist, I went to the teachers and I said, These are all first grade teachers, because guess who's already standing out in first grade? All the little behavior problem kids. And just like Ryan said, they were all boys except one was a girl. I said, you can give me any kids you want. I need 6 kids. I'm going to put them in a group. I'm going to do a 6-week class on following the rules. And just like Stephen said, rigorous discipline, I use the point system. They got lots of rewards for doing the right thing, raising their hand, all the things the teacher would want you to do in classroom. And then, if they didn't do what I wanted them to do, it's like, oh, I'm sorry. Maybe next time you'll remember to raise your hand, because then you get a point. They figured it out like that. They were on it. And guess what the reward was? You're not going to believe this. A picnic. I was going to put on a picnic for them in the school grounds on a Saturday. Well, I had just started to date my husband, Richard, who's standing in the back there. And he did not know what he was getting into when he agreed to help me do this picnic. Because suddenly I realized 6 kids and me, who are all, questionable behavior. He came to the picnic. Every one of these kids had no father in the home. I was so embarrassed. They hung all over Richard. They just wanted to touch him. They wanted him to hold his hand like this so they could show that they could hang from it. And it was like the whole time. And I thought, these kids are so hungry for a man to just even touch them or pay attention to them. And so early in my career, I realized how important that was and how we had to work with that and help meet a need for these children. So thank you for asking that question.
Excellent. David, you have a question.
Again, I want to say thank you to the panel. It's been fantastic just to sit back and listen. And I've been doing my best to keep up. I've been taking a lot of notes. Give me a few moments to tell you a little bit about me. I'm a combat instructor. I'm the mechanism by which the Marines that I train learn to kill. And learn to kill in an ethical environment and the conditions that Stephen has described. And so one of the things that when I found out we were doing this, I said to myself, well, wow, how is it that, I'm teaching kids that come from all walks of life, and many times the combat instructor is the first time, the drill instructor, it's the first time they've ever even seen a positive male role model. And so it occurred to me, well, how is it we figured out how to teach all these kids how to do these deadly things, and to a high degree, I might add, that you don't see, certainly, and I'm not going to hopefully we don't see this happen, but you don't have this, phenomena of Marines and soldiers returning and going to mass shootings. You don't see that. You see the PTSD, we see some of those things happen, and of course that's bad. But again, how have we figured that out? And so to that end, I've been listening to our panel, and I've been taking notes, and some of the things that I've circled, Stephen said no value of self can translate to potentially no value of life. No self-esteem, we don't value other human lives. John has mentioned, Dr. Chang said, what can a child do? Mrs. Rydell, you presented so much to us. It's fantastic. And I like your solutions. Teachers teaching new info is one of the things that I wrote down. And that's going to speak to the rest of my kind of notes that I've made on each of you. Societal truth begins to cause moral confusion, right? Because society's truth begins to change as society deems fit. And so that truth then is this moving thing. It's not something that we can kind of all say that's the truth. So I'm going to skip to the question, I suppose, to save time. Everybody else is here. Where does value come from? You said earlier about the Second Amendment, these rights came from God. So to indict the Second Amendment then is to indict God. To criticize what the Creator has created and the roles that are traditional for, I think, all of us, fairly common sense about, like who's going to protect the family when someone comes into the home? It's either going to be the largest person there, right? The person who has the most situational awareness to deal with that, or it's going to be the man, right? Maybe it's an adult woman, but it's the largest person there to defend that home. Traditionally, that's men. So some of this stuff, and again, I'm picking on a few of the panel members, but if a male loses his role in society, how is that role going to manifest itself? If young men aren't given positive ways to think and feel about who they are and what they are, how will that be made manifest? And is that something that we can look at and do or not? Can we do something about that? So my question to the panel then is, what are we teaching? All of you are either several years in collegiate atmosphere, several years in your degrees. What has been taught, what has been your exposure to what's taught about values, about ethics? In the Marine Corps, in the military, we're teaching these people how to kill, but along with that, in the martial arts, all of that stuff, there's a huge degree of ethical decision-making, ethical discussion about use of force and right versus wrong. And I can't take credit for it, but Lieutenant Colonel Schusko, who's a kind of eminent, always been the director of the Martial Arts Center of Excellence, has created a book called Science to Life. It's a fantastic book. But General Krulak before him, when they looked at 2000 and we had the Columbine shooting, how are we going to keep an active youth joining the military? And how are we going to keep our Marine Corps, if you will, or our young people still focused on ethics in a modern time, in a society that's changing? Right, so that was 2000. Well, we're 20 years or so from that. And what's changed? And a lot's changed. But so again, my question then is, what could you say, or what would you propose would be the discussion about how can we now begin to teach values? How can we teach, even if it's something in ethics, at a middle school level, at an appropriate age where children can begin to be exposed to, call it moral philosophy or social contract theory on a adolescent level. So I encourage any of the panel members to. Actually,
Kendra, I think you should be the one to answer this one.
I was going to try to, monopolize the discussion. So I'm glad you already selected me. So I would argue that the ethic that is being taught to our teenagers and our youth is we could argue that they're not really values at all. And they care mostly about capitalism and consumerism and self-gratification. So I posed the question to my students the first day of class, why are you all here? And they go, well, because you're supposed to go to college. I go, well, why are you supposed to go to college? Well, to get a bachelor's degree. Well, why would it? Why does it matter if you get a bachelor's degree? And they go, to make money, duh. So there's not a passion for learning anymore. We're teaching our youth that what matters is economic success. And we could argue that that's been embedded in our culture for a long time. So Max Weber wrote this wonderful book a long time ago, and he argued that the Protestant work ethic that sort of was embedded in our society and our systems of values and norms is what led us to be such an economically prosperous society. So students, young people, they're worried about making money, they're worried about self-gratification. This, again, helps with that. And they're not pursuing things that they love. They're not pursuing things that they are passionate about. And I think that would take care of most of the problem, right? So I always have students that come to me and they go, I want to major in, I'm a business administration major, but I hate all my classes, right? But I really love philosophy. What do you think I should do? And their parents are telling them, no, do what's logical, do what's going to make you money. And they're not finding niches that they sort of like care about, that they love. But your question was about ethics, right? And related to our last question from the gentleman in the back, and talking about fatherless households, I think that is a really important component that we all, I think we all recognize it, but we just didn't speak to it in our talks. And there's a fantastic experiment going on in Richmond, California, in the Bay Area. And what they've done is they've taken African-American males who have served time in prison, who now have their lives together, and they pair them up with mentees in the community, with young African-American males in the community who are at high risk to engage in criminal activity. And they've seen an incredible transformative change in Richmond, California. It was one of the deadliest cities to live in a couple years ago. And so going back to community-based solutions, right? This is something that we might think about. We can't force fathers to stay, right? But what we could do is use community-based solutions to, improve mentor-mentee relationships between, just like Richard, right, was like turned into daddy for so many little kids. I'm sure that there are, my dad, for instance, he's retired, he's got time. I'm sure there are plenty of great role models, even in this room, that would be willing to do that. would the schools facilitate that? Would like the church facilitate that? I'm not quite sure, but check out what's happening in Richmond. I think it's a really great success story. So.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions? Yes.
I don't want to circle too much on the manhood thing coming up again, but as a father, by the way, thank you. You're challenging a lot of my ideas and validating others. I really appreciate that. I'm glad I'm here. I think my job as a father is to show my son what men do, how men behave. They go to work every day, they come home every night. How do they treat their mother? I'm showing my daughter how to expect to be treated by men. It is instilling discipline, but to me, that's what I think I can teach my son. Since you started it, most of you move around the idea of masculinity. But one of my conclusions is, I'm sure you tested it, is we need to connect. Right? And you mentioned, Kendra, hyper or hypo? Hyper-masculinity. And I guess my question is for anyone here. Most of you addressed it, I think, or sort of circled around it, and that is, what is hyper-masculinity?
I think I'm a terrible person to answer that question for that woman, right? But maybe there's
You know what? Actually, if you don't mind me trying to tackle this one. So I'm going to tell you, those of you who know me, my wife would probably agree, I am completely antagonistic towards what I would define as hypermasculinity. Hypermasculinity is tyranny. Hypermasculinity is the idea that I am going to use my size, my stature, my intellect, or my weaponry to force somebody else to behave in a manner in which they otherwise would not have been able to do. What is the ultimate definition of violence? The ultimate definition is that I was not able to convince you to do something either through my persuasive capabilities, through the economic capability that I had to pay you for your labor or your product or whatever it is. So instead, I'm going to use fear or the threat of death or great bodily injury in order to extract what I couldn't have done with my own, with my intellect or everything else. Okay, somebody that's predisposed to that type of behavior, I would articulate as hypermasculinity. Okay, I want, hey, you know what? You're sitting in my chair. Oh, I'm sorry. I'd beat the crap out of the guy for having just seated in that. That's hypermasculinity. We could call it antisocial behavior, whatever. The fact of the matter is, rarely do we see this behavior manifest in women, or if we do, we tend to apologize for it. Oh, it's that time of the month. You know, she's premenopause. It happens. We make excuses all the time. Okay, but in females, I would call it hypermasculinity. Right? I see no distinction on that. Masculinity is the acknowledgement that you're a dude. Okay, and with it comes certain responsibilities. You need to be a gentleman. There is no excuse for non-gentlemanly behavior. It's simply utterly unacceptable. You need to follow the dictates of society. Those dictates change. We behave in a manner that's fundamentally different than we did in the 1790s. Our language changes, our social norms changes. There's a lot of things that alter, all right? But wherever we find ourselves in history, we have a social duty to adhere to those social norms. And all the attendant benefits of, protecting the weak and everything else. Lack of masculinity, under-masculinity, the feminization of the American male, that's the antithesis of being a man. That's the abdication of personal responsibility. That's taking away the idea that you as a man have a responsibility to act in a certain way. Now, this has no way am I trying to put any sort of negativity towards sexual orientation or anything like that. A person is how a person is. I fundamentally believe that they have a right to the pursuit of happiness and however they see fit without the confines of government control. But the reality is that as a man, we have a certain expected behavioral characteristic. Does that make sense? How'd I do? Yeah? All right.
I would just like to add, and just to kind of tie it back into the question of where does value come from, not to overstep my bounds, but I also consider myself to be a person of faith. One of the things that I really liked, I heard this and then I had to really research it, and I was so glad when I found out that it was true. There's the really famous verse from the Bible that's, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Meek does not mean what we now consider meek to mean. It does not mean weak. You cannot be a good person from a state of weakness because you don't have a choice. Meek, in the sense of that Bible verse, is strength restrained. It translates more directly to those who have swords and know how to use them, but choose to keep them sheathed, is what meek means. It is a restraint of the strength. And you're absolutely right that it is, I believe, it is the job of the father to show their sons how to do that. I was fortunate enough to go on a lovely trip to Haiti. If you've never been, you have to have the goat. It's delicious, right? But it is a country where over 90% of the population is unemployed. It's the poorest population in the Western Hemisphere, and it is a country without fathers. And we were in a small village in Maïsad outside of Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and you would see kids in the village, and again, it's the same thing that Laura mentioned. They would run up to you, and they are so hungry for male attention. And you're walking to and from the village, and the little kids are pushing each other, and if you have boys, you know that things can escalate very quickly. And those kids don't know how to handle those emotions. So it goes from, oh, pushing each other, to all of a sudden you have two kids trying to hit each other in the head with rocks. And you have to pull them apart, and you have to say, that's not how you behave. And you have an entire country, in the case of Haiti, growing up like that. And it's a really, really sad thing because you've got some sweet kids in that town. And just to kind of, one of the other little observations is, it's harder to identify what a dysfunctional family is, especially in a lot of my experiences, because you'll have parents who will have a happy marriage and they'll be very successful, but you know, in South Orange County, a lot of times maybe the dad has to travel, so he's not around very much. And you call them the I generation. Yes. We have a slightly different term that one of my colleagues came up with. They call it the FU mom generation, because all of a sudden we're in a meeting with a student and a parent, and the kid is like, "I know, mom, God," and that's how they respond to their mother, because no one is around to tell that kid that you don't talk to your mother that way. And that kind of conduct is just not acceptable. So yeah, I think there absolutely is it's sort of like a call to arms for fathers.
Interesting. Yeah, Clay.
Yeah, we're kind of getting close to the end of our time, and anybody here have a teen, a child that goes to school? So I'm guessing you guys are here because you want to understand something that will impact your child's safety. And if I could give you 3 things really fast, that if you do these things, your child is going to be safer and probably have fewer mental health issues. Number 1, you got to talk to your kid. And I mean, that's more than just telling your child on the way out that I love you, but intentionally create time to sit down with your child that doesn't include screens or distractions. Family dinner. There's been a study that was done, showed that families had family dinners, those children had fewer mental health issues and behaviors that led to drug use, alcohol use, violence, all sorts of things. And families that did that, those kids had fewer mental health issues than families that didn't do those things. And moreover, the more you did it, it even had a bigger impact. So that's one way that you guys can do it. Number 2, you need to engage your child's digital world. We're the first generation of parents who have no idea, did not grow up in a world of social media. Our children don't know a world without it. If your child was in that world, you need to understand it. So I'm gonna plug next week at Glen Yermo Elementary. You can get the details on my website at cybersafetycop.com. It is free. If you guys want to come, 2 hours, I will blow your mind and tell you what you need to know and how you can get involved in the digital world, because in that world, your child is writing a very detailed diary about their ideas about violence, drugs, sex, and all their friends, exactly what their friends think about these things. It's called Instagram. And so you need to know what's going on there, because it may not be your kid who is contemplating suicide or thinking about, you know, what it would be like to kill somebody or whatever, but their other friends may be talking about these things, and we know that more than 80% of shooters leak this information out, not directly to the target, but to other people, and usually social media where that's happening. So you need to understand that. So you're protect your child against sexual predation, violence, all these other things, all happening on social media. And last thing, accountability. There should not be a place in your kid's world that you cannot stick your nose into and know what's going on. When you are cleaning your kid's room, you should be looking in your kid's stuff. You get what you inspect, not what you expect. Look in your kid's backpack. When I would do searches of children's rooms that made threats at schools, that was one thing. We go and talk to parents. Can I search your kid's room? I go into their computers. I go into their backpacks. I look at every sheet in their note paper. And on the top drawer of this boy's computer desk were volumes of these of notebooks about his thoughts about death and murder, including killing his family. And it was all there. And the parent had never once stepped into the kid's room, because that was his space. It is your space, it's your phone, and there's too much at stake for you not to be involved with your kid. So if you do those things, and do the kind of things that our parents did, which was ask who you're going to hang out with and what you're doing, and be engaged, pull your kid off of screens, look for things to do with your kid that doesn't include screens. Your kid doesn't know what to do when there's not screens on anymore. They don't understand that, and maybe you need to help them a little bit. Your kid will have fewer mental health issues, fewer issues of delinquency and those kinds of behaviors, and you're going to also know what's going on in their lives. And if you do those things, you can't make the world perfectly safe, but you can mitigate a lot of that risk by being involved. And unfortunately, the old methods aren't going to get it done. You got to get involved in kids' digital world.
Well said, Clay. Thank you very much. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hate to do this because I know some of you still have questions. These guys have to eat, and we allotted this thing till 8 o'clock. So here's what we're willing to do. I'm going to close this out. I think some of these guys will probably hang out here for a little bit. So if you want to come up and ask them questions offline, that's absolutely awesome. I'd like to thank all of you guys for being willing to participate in this tonight. I personally found it incredibly valuable. Thank you very much. Since I have a shamelessly captive audience, briefly, okay. Clay has some of the his stuff up there on the digital world. Go take a look at that stuff up there. From an Artemis Defense Institute, for those of you who are not already members here, we have a program called the Guardian Membership. I highly, highly recommend that you take a look at this, even if you have absolutely no interest in training with weapons or anything like that. That Guardian membership, number one, it supports us. Number two, it gives you the ability to access our podcasts where Cosmo and I yell at each other for 20 minutes about the law and tell each other that we're idiots and all these other types of things. So guys, highly, highly encourage you to take a look at that. Again, thank you guys very, very much.